No worries.
So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Zoom talk called Town Planning Rebellion, why we need a rebellion in our town, in our planning system. And our special guest tonight is Mark Allen, and he's joining us from Melbourne. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. Just before we get going, I'll just read the Acknowledgement of Country. So I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the First Nations people on whose stolen land we live and work. I acknowledge their wisdom in caring for the land and the grief that they feel as their country suffers the effects of climate change and global warming, which is a product of colonisation. I also acknowledge the important role that First Nations people play in the fight for climate justice. I'm on the land of the Kaurna people tonight, like many of us. If you're on someone else's land and you'd like to pop it on the chat, that would be a lovely way of acknowledging. I can see some people have already done that. Thank you so much. Stephen's on Paramount Country, which is the Adelaide Hills, and there might be a couple of other people from the hills joining us later on. So thank you very much, Mark, again, and I will hand over to you and we'll get your PowerPoint presentation working.
Thank you so much, Gabby. Right, okay, let's see if I can do this. So if I go to click on speaker view, go to gallery view. So to get the PowerPoint going, do I click on the share screen option again?
Yep, share screen.
Yep, share. And then I just click on the PowerPoint. Now go share. Oh, yeah. Does that come up?
Flawless, Mark.
Oh, look at this, you see. Great. Okay, and I will move you a little bit over so I can see the screen a bit more. All right, well, so far so good. Welcome, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for coming along tonight. I really appreciate it. Town Planning Rebellion is quite a new setup, a new organisation. This is the first time I've really reached out beyond Victoria, really, on this issue. And I am keen for at least some of the issues that Town Planning Rebellion, if not all of them, become key factors of conversation in the ongoing wider conversation that we need to have in terms of how we transition to a society that can not only overcome the climate ecological emergency, but create a resilient, low carbon, high biodiversity society. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll start. What I'll do is I'll start by why isn't that flicking to the next slide? Let's have a look. It's not flicking to the next slide for some reason, Gary.
You could try the space bar or the arrow.
Yeah, it was doing it before and now it's not. So that is a problem, isn't it?
Okay,
I thought it was.
Stop sharing. That's okay.
Stop share. If I just go back to share screen, if I go share, if I go to
It was working before. Try escape.
Yep, I've tried that, and it's not. If I just make it smaller, how do I make it? Pause share, resume share.
If you try putting your arrow down on the left-hand bottom corner of the slide, you might find that you come up with symbols to move on.
No, it's not doing that. What I need to do, if I go back to the start, I don't know why it's not doing it. It was doing it fine before.
Don't you worry. I will share mine if you like.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. If you could, that would be great. All right. Well, while you're setting that up, I can talk you through the first slide anyway. Yeah, so basically the first slide is an image to remind everyone how serious the situation is that we're in right now. I always a lot of the talk at the moment is we are in a climate and ecological emergency, and it's become part of the mainstream narrative, which is great. But there is also a risk that we kind of underplay it a little bit. Like, yeah, we're in a climate and ecological emergency. The latest evidence coming out, is that the rate of melting of the ice caps of the Antarctica, Greenland, is at the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that you, Gabby? Now put that on the screen. Yeah, that's great.
It is.
Okay, if you could you flick it to the next slide. Anyway, so yes, that is the issue that we're dealing with. We're in a serious climate and ecological emergency, and I think it's worth always bearing that in mind. That in the words of Rupert Reed, he says that basically the civilization that we are in now is finished. We are going to need to either transition into a different type of civilization, or the civilization is going to collapse due to the climate and ecological emergency, and will be propelled into some other form of living that isn't necessarily exactly how we would like it to be. So the key for us is to work as much as possible to actually choose how we can transition the civilization we're in now to one that can overcome and mitigate this rapidly declining, deteriorating situation that we are in. So this is why I always start by reminding people of the seriousness of the situation. A little bit about my background. I've been an environmental activist for quite a few years, on and off, and I used to work as a town planner. And that was how I wanted to get involved in environmental work through working as a planner. I was born and brought up in the Cotswolds in Great Britain, and I was in that sort of last generation of children that got to roam the countryside, and that's where I got my deep connection with nature. But even as a young child, I could see urban encroachment onto the landscape, and woodlands that I used to play in, and all of those things, I could see them being eaten away by development. So my pathway into the environmental movement was from a land use, a town planning, urban sprawl pathway. That's what empowered me, and that's what empowered me to become a planner. And actually did my planning degree in Adelaide. I did it at University of South Australia on City East campus on North Terrace. And it was great. I learned a lot. But when I joined the planning profession, I realized quite quickly that planning is very much a damage control, a damage limitation exercise. That basically we, as planners, were doing what we could to make the best job out of a situation and an economic system that relies upon perpetual development and continual development and construction. And over the last 20 years, our economic system has become increasingly reliant upon construction and development as a way of measuring GDP. So the more we've become reliant upon it, the more addicted we've become. And that has translated into the constant pressures to cut so-called green tape and reduce heritage legislation so that buildings can be pulled down, the powers of things like the Property Council, who are constantly trying to increase the urban growth boundary into areas of high biodiversity. So I rapidly realized that I didn't have the emotional capacity to work from within as a planner. Now, there are many good planners out there who do have that capacity and are willing to sort of do what they can to make the best out of a bad job. And those people are really important. We need those people. But for me, it's like, well, if I'm going to leave the planning profession, I have the luxury of being able to stand outside of the planning profession and actually say, we need to actually change the whole way we approach planning, the whole system, and to move planning, transition planning and development away from a way of trying to mitigate the worst impacts of a developer-driven, construction-driven economic system. And that's an economic system that requires perpetual development. It'll never stop. So the dense will never be dense enough, and the sprawl will never sprawl outwards enough. It's constantly needs to keep going. And the more we do it, the more addicted we become. And so, this damage limitation becomes increasingly more difficult. So over time, I decided to form Town Planning Rebellion. So that's my background. Now. What I would like to, if I might just try one more time to see if I can get the slideshow up. Oh, no, brilliant. Gabby's onto it. Great. Could you flick it forward one more slide? Okay, so that was the slide that went with my last little bit of blurb. That's where I was brought up. That's the landscape. I was very lucky. I was very lucky in that I was brought up in this landscape here. This is where I connected with nature. This is where I could see rapid development happening. So, okay. So if you could flick it to the next slide, Gabby, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so why is town planning a major issue? Well, for one, obviously we're in a climate and a biodiversity emergency, and we really need to emphasize the biodiversity side of the emergency. And, there are a lot of pressures on Australia's biodiversity, obviously land clearing for logging, clearing for creating pasture, farming, all of that kind of thing. But also the land clearing for increased urban sprawl is a major factor that's impacting our biodiversity here in Australia. And part of the reason for that is because the areas where humans want to live are generally some of the most biodiverse parts of the country. Now they've got this slide here says, that just 0.2% of Australia is highly urbanized, yet a quarter of threatened plants and nearly half of threatened animals also live in these areas. So it's no surprise that people and nature both favor this kind of habitat. So we do have a crisis, especially in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, especially those greater conurbations. And the greater conurbations of Melbourne stretch out way past places like Geelong. And the greater conurbation of Sydney really stretches up to Newcastle and down past Wollongong out towards the Blue Mountains. And some really critical habitats being impacted here in Melbourne. The grasslands that surround Melbourne are very unique. They're very important to First Nations people, of course, but there's also a lot of biodiversity that's being impacted here in Melbourne through the biodiversity loss that urban encroachment is having. So making that connection between development and planning and biodiversity loss is important, and that's one of the things that Town Planning Rebellion does. And remember, Town Planning Rebellion is all about making sure that land use planning and town planning and construction and all of those factors are part of the wider conversation about how we get ourselves out of this crisis. There's a fear that planning and development has been a little bit left behind a little bit, and there are many reasons for that. It's no one's fault in particular, but right now the major narratives are around clean energy, protecting forests, all important things, but we've got to bring things like urban sprawl and development into the picture as well in terms of how we tackle the crisis. Gabby, could you flick it through to the next slide for me? Thank you. Oh, no, if you just go back one. Oh, yes, thank you. So, of course, the response in Oh no, if you could just go. Oh,
sorry, Mark.
yes, that one there.
Actually, there's a good question from the chat.
Yeah.
You want to take questions on the way or wait till the end?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. If that's the flow we're in, I'm happy to follow that flow. Yeah.
Richard asks, is it better to be out of the tent or in the tent when it comes to making change?
Is it better to be out of the tent or in the tent?
Yeah.
I see what you mean.
Is it better to be part of the system?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
To try and do action-y?
Yeah, look, I think that the changing the system from within is a slow process, and a lot of that is damage mitigation. I think that due to the nature of the climate and ecological emergency and the fact that we need rapid systemic change and that we need to rapidly change our civilization and the way we're being, I think that there needs to be a very strong contingent of people who are out of the tent to actually make that point, because if everyone's in the tent, we're not going to get out of this. We might get the odd tree incorporated into the new development and the odd cycleway here, but the tent is very much the idea that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet. That's what the tent is. Yeah. And we have to transition from that. We've always known deep down that we can't keep having a society that follows that philosophy. But the fact is that we actually, this is the time. Well, actually, we should have done it before now, but this is the generation that actually has to make that transition, because we've hit these crisis points, these emergencies, all happening, these limits to growth. So yeah, I don't want to say that there's no place for people inside the tent, because a lot of people don't have the privilege that I've got. A lot of people who work in planning have to work in planning, and they're doing great work. And of course, it can be a bit of a polarity. A lot of outside the tent stuff can eventually turn into inside the tent stuff, and inside the tent stuff, people can provide pathways for out of the tent people. So again, there is that middle ground, and it is a bit of a polarity, so that's a good question. Thank you. And feel free, Gabby, to let me know if any more questions come up, and I'm happy to pause to answer them at any time. And if anyone else wants to ask a question who's watching here, feel free to take yourself off mute and give me a nudge. I
think Jane's just put a comment as well, which is that you need to operate where you're best suited, especially emotionally. And I think if people want to read that full comment, it's really quite insightful there.
Yes.
In politics, activists outside the political system are crucial and often the front line, for example, the school strike for climate. And then Jane asks, she's interested in hearing what you are proposing in terms of the rebellion aspect.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's right. I'll definitely come to that. I promise. And yeah, it's very true. It is very much about working within your capacity as well, and where you're strongest. And there are many ways in, and there are many ways of being in this movement. There are people as you say, in the front line in the protests. There are people working on citizens' assemblies. There are people working from inside the tent, working from outside the tent. The key is to try and thread them all together so that we can be part of one comprehensive movement for change, and that we don't get caught up in conflicts, and that we see where we all are in that bigger web, and that we feel a connection to all of those different ways of being. But definitely the emotional stuff is really important. So thanks for pointing that out. So yes, what's that? Sorry?
Next slide.
Yeah, no, we'll stick to this one. So basically, so the last slide I was talking about the impact on biodiversity by urban sprawl. This slide is actually of an Adelaide home that's under threat of demolition at the moment, which is raising more than a few eyebrows. So the basic response to mitigating sprawl is increasing densities. That's the standard response that we're taught. If we increase densities, we reduce sprawl. But of course, under a growth-based system, system that we're in now that requires perpetual development and construction, any kind of densification only buys us time at the best. What we're getting is we're getting densification and we're getting sprawl, and it will be continual and ongoing. And the downside of densification is that you're losing all of the captured carbon that was all of the emissions that went into building those original buildings in the first place. Like 51% of the emissions that in the building's lifetime is actually invested in its construction. So if you pull down a building, you're using emissions in order to pull the building down. So you're emitting emissions then. You're also having to then put that into landfill, and 40% of landfill is comprised of from the construction industry, and a big chunk of that is from demolitions. And then, of course, you then replace it with something that requires more carbon emissions. And in the era that we're living in, the standard of new development is pretty low. So what's going on is they're building buildings mainly for the investment market that don't have a very long shelf life. So we're actually, in many cases, we're pulling down robust buildings in exchange for less robust buildings at massive carbon emissions. Now, 20% of emissions, 20% of all emissions in Australia are from construction. So it's a major part of the problem. So Town Planning Rebellion is about better utilizing and retrofitting existing structures as much as possible. So we're about maintenance, repurposing, retrofitting. And there are smart ways of increasing densities if need be. For example, you could put tiny houses in where that lovely lawn is. We could potentially, I'm not saying we should, but we could potentially put a small sort of tiny house settlement in the garden, replace the lawn with a food forest, create the living areas of that house into communal spaces. So there are radical ways of increasing densities if we need to increase densities without having to necessarily pull buildings down and replace them with something that is of less quality. So that's another big focus of Town Planning Rebellion. It's about managing and better utilizing and retrofitting our existing stock rather than constantly demolishing and increasing densities. Okay, if you could take us to the next slide, Gabby, that would be great. And there's also a heritage side of it as well. We're losing a lot of heritage, and every culture that's ever demolished its heritage always regrets it. And it's quite sad to see that we are losing the heritage side of things. From a climate emergency, heritage might not seem that important, but a lot of heritage buildings are actually pretty solid, robust buildings, and pulling them down doesn't make sense from a carbon emissions point of view. So retrofitting buildings, also retrofitting and better utilizing the gardens. If we were starting from scratch, we would do our suburbs differently. Probably. But we're not, and we can't. We're in a climate and ecological emergency where we need to bring emissions down to below zero in practically no time at all. The focus needs to be on retrofitting and making the most of what we have. Now, we do have a lot of large gardens. These gardens are beneficial in the sense, of course, that they're permeable, they absorb water, but they can also contain some of the nature that's prevalent in these areas. Remember, in a previous slide, I mentioned how much nature wishes to share the areas, our urban areas, with us because we're basically sharing the same space. So replanting gardens for nature and for food growing are two important steps as part of the retrofitting and repurposing and maintenance culture that Town Planning Rebellion is suggesting that we develop. And this is one example in Melbourne, which I saw on my walk the other day. I get to walk around my neighbourhood. I have an hour a day to go walking. I'm not allowed to go more than 5 kilometres away from where I live. So I've actually come to really value private gardens because this is my only connection to nature at the moment. I can't go walking in the Dandenongs anymore. So there's actually a passive recreational aspect of gardens as well. It's not just a matter of the domain of the people who live there. we can reveal gardens more towards especially front gardens. We can, by replanting, we can actually help our sense of mental well-being as well as providing places for nature. All right. Okay. Feel free to take us through to the next slide. I completely ignored my notes. I write all these notes, and
There's a couple of great points in the chat as well.
Great.
Meg and Alex both were talking about converting offices to living space in the city now that lots of people are working from home as a way of increasing housing.
Yes.
And there was a comment from Margaret about planners in Adelaide seem to be missing the value of older buildings and sorry, I've lost that comment. I sometimes think the planners in Adelaide haven't been to England and seen how the really old buildings have been utilised over hundreds of years, and that's a really good point.
It is. Thank you. Yeah, both very good points. It's not always the planners' fault. The planners are obviously, they have to work around legislation that's put in place, and a lot of the legislation that's put in place happens because of pressure from lobbies like the Property Council and governments who are connected to corporations and vested interests. So planners can sometimes be in a difficult position that they can make that what they actually think should or shouldn't happen often is pretty irrelevant. And that's one of the reasons why I left planning, because I joined planning because I wanted to make a difference, and I could only really make a difference within the confines of what the legislation allowed, and that's increasingly lessening and reducing. And especially now, in this time, this COVID crisis should have been the opportunity to develop a new normal and to use this as an opportunity to create the kind of new society that we must have. But what the powers that be are doing instead is they're actually using this as an opportunity to go back to the old normal, but this time on steroids, and they're cutting green tape, and they're giving increasing powers to the fossil fuel lobby. So it's quite depressing in that respect. But yeah, in terms of office development, definitely. So and thank you for bringing that up, because another part, so the Town Planning Rebellion has 10 points of focus that we wish to sort of discuss in various forums. One of them is about retrofitting and better utilising our existing housing, but the other is about retrofitting and better utilising buildings that aren't currently housing but can be retrofitted into housing, and offices is one prime example of that, and that's a really important one. So thank you. I'm not totally convinced that everyone's going to want to stay working at home. I think a lot of people quite like working outside of the home. But I do agree that there is going to be a lot of empty office space becoming available, and we should be looking at retrofitting that, and also retrofitting other spaces. And if you want to get really radical in some of the outer suburbs, if you wanted to increase densities there, you can convert, double garages into one-bedroom apartments and that kind of thing. We can increasingly put more granny flats into areas, and then if you start looking at tiny houses as well, there are many ways of increasing densities without having to keep pulling buildings down and replacing them. There are many empty bedrooms as well, so share house arrangements are very important. And that's often what happens in Melbourne, is you have share house arrangements where you have all the bedrooms are full, and you have often the garden that's being looked after and loved. And it's those houses that get demolished because the landlord normally rents them out as share houses until such time that they pull the house down and replace them with apartments. Then you lose the garden, you lose that permeable surface, you lose that potential food growing land in the city and nature haven. And you gentrify, and at the same time you gentrify the area. So the people who were living in that share house will not be able to afford to live in the buildings that have replaced that share house. So those people generally get pushed further to the urban fringe. So people on lower incomes get pushed further to the urban fringe. That puts more development pressure on the fringe, all in the name of increasing densities, because somehow that's meant to be the green, clean way forward. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a place for increasing densities and there is a place for building new stuff. We're not completely against it, but we do emphasize the fact that the main focus needs to be on management and maintenance and retrofitting and repurposing what we already have, and that if we do increase densities, we do it in a way that doesn't gentrify areas, and that we choose the very worst housing stock to replace, the housing stock that's been the least looked after, the least maintained. And then when we do replace that housing stock, we replace it with something that's like cooperative housing or affordable housing. And those are the areas where there are actual genuine needs. That we actually do have a shortage of public housing in Melbourne, and we do need more of that. Now, there are also like 80,000 empty buildings in Melbourne, but that even so, that will not necessarily be sufficient to cater to the needs of people on low incomes or whatever who need to live in a public housing or a cooperative housing situation. So there is scope to infill and to build good quality new developments in the existing suburbs. But what happens under the current system is they'll upzone an entire area, a whole street, for higher density, which means every building in the street can be pulled down, irrespective of how decent it is. And what that does also, of course, is it raises land values. So it gentrifies the area, and it means that every building can potentially be lost. If you remove upzoning as a way of increasing densities and switch it to a method of we will only increase densities for affordable housing, it will mean that increasing densities will not result in gentrification, and it means that we can be selective about which houses we should demolish, and we can keep the best ones. And when we do replace housing for those specific needs, we can incorporate the gardens that were there before into the new development as much as possible, which is what's happened in a couple of cases in Melbourne with some co-housing developments, one of which is one called Murrindaka, where they actually incorporated the gardens of the houses that were there before, and the existing fruit trees are still there, and it's lovely to see that continuation. And the houses that they demolished were, post-war, late 40s brick bungalows that were, arguably quite would have been expensive and difficult to retrofit. So that's where we are on that. Any more questions at this stage, Gabby?
There's a couple of great comments. About the age and the lifespan of buildings. Kip says, I thought that often the lifespan of a house in Australia was estimated to be about 75 years, or that just how banks value them in terms of your mortgage. Then Sue's commented about Christie Walk, which is where she lives, which is totally fantastic.
Yes.
I urge everyone to go see it if they haven't yet.
Yes.
It's built to last at least 100 years, whereas the $1 million apartments all around us have a lifespan of 40 years. Crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Christie Walk's a great example of how you do density well, and how, there is still a role for new development, and it's not just completely about. This is why on this slide it says we need to combine the retro suburbia movement, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, with the best aspects of new urbanism. And new urbanism is about, building medium density and creating walkable neighbourhoods. Christie's Walk is a great example of that. And Sue's right. According to Professor Michael Buxton of Melbourne University, the new developments that are going up today have a lifespan of about 40 years. So there's going to be a massive need to pull down a lot of buildings over the in 20 to 40 years from now. It's very depressing. Hopefully we can find ways of increasing their lifespan, but that might be another part of what we have to do. Is we have to, as well as stopping this craziness, we might have to try and find ways of lengthening the lifespan of a lot of these buildings that are going up. I imagine a lot of people in here might have heard of Retro Suburbia, but Retro Suburbia is a major. Town Planning Rebellion connects massively with Retro Suburbia movement. It was founded by David Holmgren, of course, who co-founded the permaculture movement. He's written a massive book about this thick on it, and it really is going back to what I was talking about. It is about better utilising our existing built stock with a real massive focus on bringing permaculture into the suburbs and bringing permaculture. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, our cities are built on areas of high biodiversity, but our cities are also often built on good agricultural land. And of course, urban sprawl is encroaching onto agricultural land as well as biodiversity. So as well as preserving our agricultural land on the urban fringes by preventing sprawl, we can actually utilize these larger gardens, not just for nature, but also for growing food, which will, of course, massively decrease food miles. And especially when you're growing perishables like fresh vegetables, lettuce and fruit, things that don't store for very long and that need to be kept refrigerated. We're not going to be growing fields of wheat in the suburbs, but we can save a lot of emissions by growing perishable vegetables that require a lot of refrigeration and often need to be trucked very quickly over long distances. So yes, Retro Suburbia, I do recommend you check it out. There's also a Retro Suburbia Facebook group, which is amazing. So you can really connect with that community, and it's really big here in Melbourne. So that's part of what we're all about, embracing that and bringing Retro Suburbia into citizens' assemblies and the wider movement and how it can interconnect with that wider conversation. Okay, Gabby, if you could flick to the next slide, that would be fantastic.
Can people see that okay? Are you seeing the slide or something else? Just give me
I can see the slide,
but the writing is very, very tiny on the image.
Oh yeah, don't worry. Yeah, the image is just basically, it's a book on degrowth. And I suppose the reason for this slide is to basically, because I didn't follow my notes, I've already rambled on about how we need to live in a steady state degrowth society, I think. Maybe I haven't. So Town Planning Rebellion recognizes that we need to transition to a steady state degrowth society. So like I said before, we cannot we cannot solve the crisis we are in as long as we are in a society that thinks you can have perpetual growth on a finite planet. And there is a massive degrowth movement building. There are many books being written about it, many academics talking about it. This is a book that was co-written by Anitra Nelson, who I know quite well and is a big supporter of the work that I do as well, which I really appreciate. Our role in Town Planning Rebellion is to talk about the role that town planning will play in a degrowth society, and to bring those focus points into the conversation about how will our approach to planning be. And that's what underpins Town Planning Rebellion, is that need for systemic change. And again, like I said before, we're not like against the people who are working from inside the tent, but we are an outside the tent organization. We'll connect to people who are inside the tent, but our underlying message is that we need to transition completely to a new way of planning and development. We're not going to reach a society where we stop urban sprawl and pulling down buildings, and we transition to retrofitting and converting office developments within the existing paradigm. And we have to transition from that, because planning and development and the system we're in now is responsible for 20% of emissions and growing, and that's not taking into account the emissions from the loss of food growing land close to the cities. It's not taking into account the impact on biodiversity and all those other things as well. All right, we're going through these slides. If you could flick me through to the next one, Gabby, that would be fantastic.
Sure. There's a question from Jane, which is there anywhere in the world that practices a degrowth society? And there's also some comments as well from From Julianne from Campbelltown, looking to find ideas for how Campbelltown can become more self-sufficient with water, power, food, jobs, recreation and waste management. I'm not sure that we'd need a whole webinar to answer that one, but
yeah.
But perhaps, Julianne, if you haven't already checked out the Retro Suburbia resources, that might be a great place to start. Paul's written a long comment about South Australia and our housing and land use. I'm not sure if that's a question, Paul, or just a comment. I think it might be a comment. I'll encourage you to have a read of it. I won't read it out because it's fairly lengthy, if that's okay. And perhaps we can proceed. Mark.
No worries. Also, if anyone wants to contact me, my email address will be at the end, and people are welcome to email me, and I might be able to answer their questions to some extent, or at least connect you with someone who might be able to help and support. A country that's created no, as far as I know, there isn't a country that has created a degrowth society in the way that the degrowth movement are advocating. But of course, what constitutes a degrowth society is, of course, an ongoing conversation, and we need to have citizens' assemblies and that kind of thing in order to determine how a degrowth society would look like. But we would certainly look at certain examples. I mean, you could look at somewhere like Cuba. Now, Cuba's a double-edged sword. There's great things about Cuba and there's not so great things about Cuba. But one of the great things about Cuba is how they've managed to, not by choice necessarily, but they've managed to do a retro suburbia kind of lifestyle, mostly because they were isolated from the rest of the world. But so we can look at other countries. We can look New Zealand, certainly heading more in a degrowth direction than Australia is. Someone mentioned Japan. That's a little bit different. They're in a sort of a degrowth, but they're kind of still within the growth. They're sort of not necessarily degrowing out of choice. But yes, so definitely. Okay, yes, international stuff. So yeah, Town Planning Rebellion also, we recognise that it needs to be an international effort. We're not just a sort of Australian lifestylist group. We believe, importantly, that the degrowth movement has to have a strong component of mutual aid, where we work in partnership with other countries to share ideas and knowledge, sometimes technology and resources, in order to take a global approach to tackling the climate and ecological emergency. So Town Planning Rebellion is about sharing knowledge and experience with communities across the world so that internationally we can create resilient, low carbon communities that draw carbon into the soil and adapt and help mitigate the climate and ecological emergency. And we have a lot, obviously, to learn from the way traditional cultures have built and lived and farmed. And so it's definitely a two-way now. It's about decolonizing aid. So at the moment, a lot of foreign aid is around the existing paradigm of encouraging countries to go down the neoliberal growthist path. And a lot of foreign aid is political, and it's not necessarily proactive aid. It's aid with an agenda. So we need to take a strong decolonizing approach to aid, to a more mutual aid circumstance, and also connecting with and reconciliation and treaties with Indigenous people as well is a big component of Town Planning Rebellion as well. The First Nations cultures and understanding of the land, reaching out and working with them, and understanding that until there's true reconciliation and partnership with First Nations people, we're not going to properly tackle these crises. These crises are a result of the mindset that started with colonialism and has led to neoliberalism and the situation that we're in today. So yes, so we are very much involved in the need for decolonizing aid, and that's also taking that into the wider degrowth movement as well. So it's not just a Town Planning Rebellion thing. We're actually saying any kind of degrowth philosophy has to take an international mutual aid approach. So yeah, that's that slide. Any comments or questions at this stage?
Perhaps I'll just throw in a comment, which is that because our regular bunch has been doing a lot of thinking and talking about economics, we think about growth in perhaps a slightly different framework than what you're talking about, and we recognise that some things need to grow and other things need to shrink in terms of economic growth. We need to grow people's prosperity of the people who are absolutely, living on $40 a day. We can't let that continue. And yet we need to shrink a whole bunch of other things around wealth inequality and carbon emissions and all of that stuff. So it's shrink a lot of big things and grow some things that meaning that people miss out on opportunities and prosperity.
Absolutely, yeah, I totally agree. No, I think we're completely on the same page. This is why I actually prefer the term steady state economy to degrowth personally, because I think steady state doesn't give the impression that everyone needs to be having less and less, and that there can't be any growth within it. The term degrowth seems to have taken hold though. And that seems to be the sort of the dominant term that people use. So I quite often say degrowth stroke steady state economy.
Yeah.
My perception of degrowth is literally that we cannot have a society that says we can have infinite growth on a finite planet.
Yeah.
That's the big underlying picture. It doesn't say that people can't grow their prosperity or there can't be growth within that, relative growth within that. And absolutely, it's not a race to the bottom.
Yeah,
It is there is, as you say, it's about better distributing resources, and better distributing resources means that some people are going to grow in prosperity and others who are already very prosperous are going to find ways of living within their means more.
So we're talking about that old thing, private sufficiency, public luxury, which is something I always come back to. Yeah,
that's right. And it is an ongoing conversation as well. This is, and I'll get to the whole citizens' assemblies thing, but I do think that we need to try and find some common ground in the area of the fact that we need to transition from a infinite growth on a finite planet. But that's really all the common ground we need in order to start that conversation. But that's where we come from anyway, and that's what we bring to the table. So
have you looked at the donut economics model much with Kate Raworth?
No, I haven't. I'm not a great economist. I've just started to get my head around modern monetary theory, which is great, and I know that you're all very big on that. And modern monetary, from my limited knowledge of economics, because the whole idea, you see, is I bring these ideas in, and there are people who experts on economics in the degrowth system within the degrowth steady state movement who can talk us through these things better than I can. But my understanding is that modern monetary theory is, and again, it's limited knowledge, is going to play a really important role in how we transition from the system we're in now to a different kind of system. And the problem, how I see it, is that especially from a town planning perspective, and again, don't bite my head off if I'm wrong, because you probably all know more about this than me. The problem is that state governments rely upon funding they rely upon development for their funding for their economy, because they're not the currency providers. They're not getting enough money from the federal government. They're not getting money from the
government as well.
And local government. So there will need to be. You could some people say we should abolish state governments completely and just have federal and local government. I'm not necessarily saying that, but it's certainly an interesting idea. But we certainly need more investment and from the actual currency providers being the federal government investing into the states, if we're going to transition away from a society that's so heavily reliant upon development and construction. Because right now state governments will say we've got no choice, we have to go down this path because this is where we get our money. So modern monetary theory, it is crucial in that respect from my perspective. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, no,
nice.
I think we're definitely on the same page there for sure.
Great, cool. So let's flick through to the next slide if that's easy to do. Yeah. Now, someone earlier on mentioned the emotional stuff, and so basically, Town Planning Rebellion shares the three demands of Extinction Rebellion. The fact that we need to tell the truth, the fact that we need to get to net zero emissions by 2025, the fact that we need to work out the policy and the philosophy through citizens' assemblies. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But also we have a fourth and a fifth demand. Demand is really not the best word. Fourth and a fifth, ideal. The fourth is what I just talked about, the fact that we need to commit to some form of systemic change. My worry is that unless we at least have some common ground on the need to transition to some kind of change of system, citizens' assemblies are in danger of being hijacked by vested interests in development and the growth lobby. So I think that there does need to be that understanding that we need some form towards some kind of steady state society. But the other issue is that we are not going to change the system with the same thinking that led us into it. So we have a behavioral aspect to it as well, that there needs to be a philosophy about how we communicate and work with each other that is based around cooperation, looking for the common ground, trying to channel conflicts into positive outcomes, and that requires a change in the way we communicate and behave. And Extinction Rebellion understands this. This is why they have the three demands, because they don't want to get caught up in ideological posturing. They don't want to get caught up in the divisions that split movements like movements that have happened before. They really do care about making sure that every part of every person and every person can work together. But how do we make that happen? You can see here that even though they're trying, you can see from this tweet here, which I've put up, Extinction Rebellion saying here, we don't want to trust any single ideology. We have citizens' assemblies to do that, so that they can really focus on bringing people together on those two issues, and then people can sort their ideologies out in citizens' assemblies. But of course, when you have a big organization like Extinction Rebellion, it's very hard. There are a lot of divisions and a lot of areas of conflicts, and even Extinction Rebellion's tweet here still ruffled feathers, as you can see. David Graeber, who actually very sadly passed away just literally the day after he did this tweet. It's probably one of the last tweets he did, which is quite pertinent. But this David, made a point here. Even though Extinction Rebellion were trying to de-escalate the situation, he said, "Well, why aren't you also, saying you're not pro-capitalist either?" So there needs to be a willingness in everyone's. Everyone needs to have a willingness to de-escalate and look for the common ground. And find ways of understanding that we're not going to solve the climate and ecological emergency with the same thinking and mindset that led us into it, and that there's going to be many different opinions, It's going to be many different opinions that saves the planet. So the movement that we create needs to be about focusing on the areas of interconnection rather than getting caught up in the politics of difference. Like, for example, Town Planning Rebellion has 10 focus points. I haven't listed them in order, but I've pretty much talked about a lot of them. You feel free to look on the website. But you may not agree with all of our positions on everything, and that's absolutely fine. What we do care about is connecting with people on those issues where we do share common ground, because the planet cares about our actions, not our opinions. And the outcome is always going to be different to how one person can ever perceive it, because it's a much bigger, wider conversation that can never be encapsulated by one mind. It's creating a culture that's comfortable with that we come in, we bring our perspectives forward, we're going to interconnect with people, we're going to be part of a wider movement that we all feel part ownership of, that we all feel that we're part of, that we're all part of an ongoing conversation, but we're not all going to get our way on every issue. And to create a culture where we're comfortable about that, and where understanding that and looking for the interconnection is more important than getting caught up in the differences, because we don't have time. We don't have time for that anymore. It's an indulgence. So I got involved in the holistic activism movement. And feel free to, if you could flick through to the next slide, that would be great, Gabby. So holistic activism is about that. It's about the fact that we need a more holistic approach to activism, because we can only achieve real, decent systemic change with the behavioural change. You peel the onion back a layer, we get to the behavioural change that underlies it. And Town Planning Rebellion works to holistic activism principles as much as it can. So Town Planning Rebellion has the same three, just to recap, it has the same three demands as Extinction Rebellion, plus one on the need for systemic change, plus one on the need for taking a more holistic approach to activism, a more social permaculture, eco-psychology approach.
Can you just remind us the three demands of Extinction Rebellion? Tell the truth.
Tell the truth, net zero emissions by 2025, which is not very likely, but it's good to aim for that. And then the third is to create policy through citizens' assemblies.
Yeah.
And this is really, the citizens' assemblies is really where Town Planning Rebellion comes in, because as someone asked earlier, what are we going to do? Well, when you're an organization that's basically saying that you need complete, total systemic change, and we need a completely different approach to planning that isn't around maintaining an economic system reliant upon construction, there aren't a lot of areas where you can go to other than the fact that you take this to the citizens' assemblies. Now, Extinction Rebellion have created this third demand as a way of making sure that all of these areas of how we go about transitioning to the new kind of society is done in that way. Now, the idea of citizens' assemblies is that it's done through sortition, so that members of the public are chosen in the same way, like the same way that a jury is chosen, and then you bring experts and groups and different people who know stuff about stuff to come in and talk about what should or shouldn't happen, and then the people in the citizens' assembly listen to everything, and there's breakaway groups and discussions, and then they come up with ideas that lead to policy. So Town Planning Rebellion is about saying, first of all, town planning needs to be absolutely fundamental part of the solution to the crisis that we're in. So there needs to be citizens' assemblies based around land use planning. And land use planning, town planning, of course, intersects with so much else. It intersects with regenerative farming, with clean energy, with public transport, with saving food miles by preserving food on the fringe, by biodiversity. So it really does intersect with all of those issues, but it needs to be central, or one of the central pivotal areas of how we tackle emergency. So we're there to say, and we want other groups to do this. We don't want to be the only group. We're actually quite a small group, but we want to encourage other people to set up their own groups. They can steal some of our ideas. They can have as much or as little of our ideas as they want. They can start up their own town planning rebellions, which is identical to ours, or they can start at one with different focus points. But what's important is that we create forums for groups who care about planning to go into citizens' assemblies and talk about these issues, so that the juries selected by sortition can come up with policies that we can then put out into the main sort of narrative of how we change the society. So and of course by talking about these issues, we kind of normalize them as well. So it's not just about having citizens assemblies, but it's also about giving talks and running workshops and doing this kind of thing, so that we keep that conversation fresh in people's minds about what town planning might look like in a low carbon society, in a degrowth society, and to keep those conversations going, so that when people do go into the assemblies, they have a little bit of knowledge about this kind of thing as well.
Final slide?
Sorry?
Final slide?
Yeah. How are we doing for time, by the way? There's no time on my computer now. The slides are on, of course. Are we doing all right?
No, we're doing fine. It's just 8:05, so.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is the final slide. Basically, this is how you can contact me or connect with Town Planning Rebellion. We have a Facebook group. You can email me. You can go to the website. Now, the Town Planning Rebellion page is on the Holistic Activism website, just to save money, really. Rather than having two websites, we have a Town Planning Rebellion page on the Holistic Activism website. And because it's a Holistic Activism inspired organization, we kind of get away with it like that. But yeah, so please feel free to reach out and connect if you want to set up or be involved in anything like this in Adelaide. Start your own. Doesn't have to, as I say, even if you have different areas to focus, we just want to reach out to people who care about planning and who want to carry important planning issues into that citizens' assembly process. And so, yeah, we really are just in many ways an umbrella group to provide support and help with other people, depending on where they're at with things. So, yeah.
Great. I might just stop the screen sharing, if that's okay, at this point. I did post the website in the chat, so people can find it in the chat and click on it from there.
Perfect. Thanks, Gabby, and thanks for helping me with that. I don't know why it didn't work on the computer. I thought it was too good to be true, but
it was working fine when we practiced it. But
it was.
Okay.
It was.
Think, like, I don't know if people would join me in putting their hands up for more discussion on the rebellion part of Town Planning Rebellion. Maybe if people are keen for that, like, I'd like to mention a couple of things that happened here. I noticed there was a bit of direct action happening where during COVID lockdown, where some banners started appearing on significant trees around the place, which were bearing a sign saying, "How many more, Premier?" You know, how many more of these are you going to sacrifice or cut down and get rid of? And I think that was quite effective. It certainly got a lot of media. I wonder if that type of direct action, or even going a bit further and, getting between the chainsaw and the tree, not that I'm recommending that particular thing, but, are we at the point where we need to do that?
Oh, yeah. We're at the point where we need to do everything. So we're at the point where we need to be doing all of this. And certainly, if people wanted to do that kind of thing under the banner of Town Planning Rebellion, then bring it on. We're at the moment, we are literally just about communicating ideas about what we can take to the citizens' assemblies of Extinction Rebellion, and doing that in a way, but also, obviously, the main aspect of Extinction Rebellion is direct action. So we encourage people in Town Planning Rebellion to get involved in the direct action. And if they want to get involved in areas like that, and even if they decided to use the Town Planning Rebellion banner or whatever, that's great. But this movement can evolve in many different ways depending on where it goes or who joins or what. At the moment, we don't have the capacity to get involved in a lot of protests, especially under lockdown. But certainly, I've been involved in Extinction Rebellion protests, and will certainly be bringing a Town Planning Rebellion banner to the next March, and we will be engaging with people who do want to do that kind of thing. I can see potentially people squatting empty houses, houses that have been left empty in Melbourne. There are 80,000 empty houses in Melbourne, and they're bulldozing sacred grasslands to build more. That could be a path we go down. We could go down that path where we are doing those things, but right now we're just on the path of communicating ideas and taking things to the citizens' assemblies. But if we go down in another direction of a more protest focus, or if other people want to do that, then that's fantastic. It's an ongoing conversation. So yeah.
Well, I just think that the law is stacked against protecting nature. I mean,
yes.
I'm not an environmental lawyer, but I've worked for the Environmental Defender's Office for 11 years, and I've seen how planning law has just gone further and further towards the side of people who want to build things rather than people who want to save things that are already there. And it's come to a point where people don't even bother trying to use the law to protect nature anymore, because if you've got a significant tree, it only has to be within 20 meters of a house, and or a building or a fence or a pathway, and you can argue that it's a fire risk or a safety risk, and get rid of it. You can always find an arborist who's going to give you the report that you need to get rid of it if you're a developer, right?
Yeah, of course. I very much agree. I did my work experience at the Adelaide Hills Council and know all about that. Yeah.
So I actually do think it can come to a point where, like, another great example was those trees on North Terrace, that people were devastated to lose those trees. People went down and held vigils. They waited overnight. Some people chained themselves to the trees, and it came to nothing in the end. But maybe that's the only avenue we have left.
Well, this is it. You see, a lot of these individual protests have a high burnout rate. It's a lot of energy, and quite often we lose them. So I don't want to take away the importance of these protests, because they're important, and they do actually highlight to the wider public the issues that are going on. But they are also putting out spot fires, and you put out one spot fire, another one emerges, and quite often we lose. Occasionally you might win the odd one. But generally speaking, we generally lose, and there's always more and more spot fires coming up, and then people burn out, as you say. It's exhausting, which is why, again, there needs to be a group that says we need to change the system that creates these spot fires from happening, and the only way we can do that is to protest, which is great, but we also need to be having people in citizens' assemblies coming in and making that clear, and bringing members of the public in to hear that, so that we can follow the path that Extinction Rebellion have created. We may as well go with their flow. Extinction Rebellion are huge. We haven't got time to create a new movement. I'm not saying we should or we shouldn't, but they've created that framework, including citizens' assemblies. We may as well work with that. And I can't think of a better method anyway. But our primary issue is about saying we actually have to change the system that creates those spot fires from happening, but at the same time not taking away from the importance of people doing those protests, because they are still important. It's not a one or the other, it's both.
How do you see a citizens' assembly interact, for example, with like the planning system update consultation that has taken 2 years here in Adelaide and has ended up with a result where the state government can swoop in and take ownership of a project and apply a whole new set of laws so that anything over a development over $1 million can be designated a state government project and then sort of rush through in that system rather than a council. Like, I think the establishment has basically sewn it up so that
They have
very little way of influence.
They've sewn it up, which is exactly why we need citizens' assemblies to circumnavigate that, because we can't rely upon the democratic process anymore, the process of going out to consultation, and we haven't got time, and it's increasingly sewn up to suit vested interests. So a citizens' assembly would react to that by just throwing it out and saying, well, we've got our own process here, and we increasingly have to circumnavigate that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't participate in the parliamentary democratic process. I'm not saying that we shouldn't vote. And it's important that we do. And there are people, elected people are doing great work.
Yeah.
But we cannot rely completely.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, we cannot rely completely anymore. Not that we ever could on that process, because the process that we're in is about propping up a system that isn't sustainable. This is another reason why I do believe that we need to have some kind of agreement that we need to transition to a steady state system or a degrowth system, whichever way you want to frame it, because we don't want those vested interests to filter into citizens' assemblies. And my interest is how do we create, choosing people via sortition in a jury kind of service way is great, but how do we choose the so-called experts that advises the jury? Where did they come from? Where are they sourced from? Is it going to get infiltrated by the property council? Is it going to get infiltrated by? So I do think that there does need to be some kind of agreement around, moving away from that paradigm.
How would a citizens' assembly impose its decision on the current system?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question. Is Sue here? Sue Gilby, do you want to answer that? Because you might be better at answering that than me. No? So, because I don't know.
David's here as well. He knows a bit about citizens' assembly.
I just know that this is the only path that we've got, and we need to find a way of doing that. And I know that Extinction Rebellion have chosen that path, and that it's pointless trying to reinvent the wheel. So we've somehow got to make that path work. But yeah.
Actually, can I say something?
Yeah, go
answer
for it.
that if you want.
Let's go Sue and then David.
So I've been talking to Sonia Randhawa today and over the last week, and we're looking at perhaps developing an online citizens' assembly on just the things that Mark's been talking about, and it's really quite exciting, the direction that we're going, but it's sort of not clear enough yet. But yeah, I think we're an online citizens' assembly this year.
David? Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Sue.
Hi. For those of you that haven't met me, I'm kind of new to the whole movement, but I've been active for the last year and a half. I joined Extinction Rebellion, and we've come to SA and called Plant Space. And I'm working on the citizens' assemblies in Extinction Rebellion in South Australia. The way that it works is that the actions of Extinction Rebellion and the protests and the demonstrations get to such a scale that everyone joins and the state gives up. And the way out is that they agree to citizen assemblies. That's how it works. And then what happens if they don't agree to stick with what comes out of the citizens' assemblies, the actions start up again and force them to leave again. So it's very much everyone on the streets. It's a when you've got 3.5% of the population actively on the streets, and you've tipped the scales.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some people
because the
may-
only way the citizens' assemblies works is when the government backs it 100%.
Some people may have come across that research which says that you need 3.5% of the population to disrupt a city. I think it happened in London with Extinction Rebellion earlier on in the beginning of the movement, and it was enough to force the UK government to declare a climate emergency, which was a pretty massive achievement, and it did involve, you know, a consistent and sustained level of protest, getting out there on the streets and shutting the city down. So that's definitely.
I'll just correct that, Gabby.
Sorry?
I'll just correct that a little bit. So the 3.5% is the percentage of a population that no civil disobedience campaign has ever failed if it reaches that number,
right,
of achieving their objective of changing whatever it is. So the Extinction Rebellion hasn't got anywhere near that yet in London, and still achieved a fair few things.
right.
And it's still working towards that number. Yeah.
Unfortunately, as well, even though they declared a climate emergency, it was quite arguably a lot of virtue signalling there. The UK government are not doing anywhere near what you'd expect a government to do under a climate emergency scenario. In fact, they've just given approval for, well, not just given, but they're currently constructing the HS2 high-speed rail, which is going to be the worst deforestation in England since the First World War, and the emissions in constructing it will take over 100 years to balance out, and we can't be doing anything like that in a climate and ecological emergency. It's the worst thing they could have possibly done, and it's totally unnecessary as well. Town Planning Rebellion is also very much about improving existing public transport. We're not big on building high-speed rails. We're big on improving slow rail, creating more sleeper carriages and allowing people to travel through the night, but working with existing infrastructure, because a lot of these so-called environmentally friendly solutions like high-speed rail, it takes many, many decades for the carbon emissions to balance out, and we don't have that time. So, yeah.
Not sure if that's true of, like, in Australia, if you replaced high-speed rail between Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Canberra, you'd be taking the incentive away for people to fly. So there's that. But anyway,
yes, that's true. You would to some extent, but though it would have to be cheaper than flying. And I'm not sure if it would be cheaper than flying. And the chances are that the aeroplane companies would try and make it cheaper. Again, it's still working within the existing paradigm. If we created a steady state model where we work, well, we don't have to work as much as we do. We create a culture where slow travel is embraced, and you can. When I travel before COVID times and those good old days, I just get on the overnight sleeper train in Melbourne. I go to bed and I wake up in Sydney, and it's great. It's expensive. It's more expensive than flying. It's something I do because I believe in it. But we can create a world where we're happier traveling more slowly and having things like sleeper carriages. We can circumnavigate the battle between flying and high-speed rail that would otherwise sort of happen potentially under the current system. But it's a good point, though, Gabby. I'm not discounting what you're saying. It's a very valid point.
Can I just quickly just wrap some comments and questions from the chat? And
Sure.
then tonight, I'll just finish with letting people know what's coming up that might be of interest and that what we are involved in. So just going back to the chat, there's been a few comments about citizens' assemblies. How would we know that they, how can we rely on them to not be stacked with, your kind of average swing voter establishment type? And I think that question can probably be answered pretty well by the example of the Nuclear Royal Commission, which happened in South Australia, where it's about the information that people are given, and even if you choose people at random, completely at random, or by a sortition, which is like representative of different on the political spectrum, age, background, education levels, all of that. If those people have a chance to be taught or instructed in the facts of the issue at hand, then they will make the right decision. And I think that's what we're relying on in the case of citizens' assemblies. Is that right?
That's how I hope, that's how I perceive it. Yeah, that's the optimism that I have in that area, because I really don't see any other viable alternative. So my hope is that that is right and that we can make them work. Yeah. And
Tori mentioned that if there is somebody who manages to get into the crowd who is actually a lobbyist or working for a vested interest, that person in that instance was found out and asked to leave.
Yeah. Let's hope so. Yeah.
Okay, so look, there's tons of great questions going back through the chat, but because we're coming close to 8:30, we might just wind it up unless there's some really pressing questions from the floor. Would anyone like to take the opportunity? No? Okay. Everyone's smiling, grinning at me. Thank you. That's very kind. So, yes, somebody did a public talk about sortitions at UniSA. That's interesting. Yeah, it'd be worth having a look. Feel free, anyone here, if you want to sort of stay in the loop with Town Planning Rebellion, feel free to email me, contact me through the website, and I will try and do more of this kind of thing as well. So there are many other opportunities to talk through these issues, and I'm still very much learning about citizens' assemblies myself, so always keen to get involved with people who are on that path as well. Fantastic. Thank you. I'd like just to thank you for giving us your time tonight. It's been really fascinating and interesting. And thank you. I think we do have to get out there on the streets. That's the message I'm trying to play. So. Yeah. Thanks so much. We've sent you a copy of our Stephanie
yes.
book as
what a great book.
Arriving
thank you.
in the next couple of days. So thank you again.
Appreciate that.
I'd just like to remind people that we have something really great coming up, which is we're showing the documentary Knock Down the House, which is about how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won her campaign for public office, and alongside a group of other awesome women, some of whom are now in a winning position for their campaigns to have the same kind of happy ending that AOC's did. So I have put a link to that in the chat, and I hope people can come along to that. It's on Saturday night, the 19th of September. It's an in-person event. Hooray! The first one for many, many months that we're running, which is open to the public. It's at Marion Cultural Centre. It's free. We'll probably go for drinks and nibbles afterwards at a nearby place, since we're not allowed to have them at the venue. But we would love for everybody who wants to come and to share the event around. We've got room for 70, 80 people, so we haven't got anywhere near that many booked yet. So please come and share with your friends. It's going to be a great, inspiring and fun night. I know the movie itself, I've seen it before. It leaves you in tears of joy. It's really great, and it gives you hope for the future, especially for the US, which is in dire need of some hope right now. So, yeah. And yes, it is a terrific movie. And then there's a couple of other things coming up. Get Up has organised our well-known economist friend Warwick Smith, who did a talk for us earlier, to give a series of 3 talks/workshops on Economics and Rethinking Capitalism, although I'm not sure what the title of the series is. I hope it's not that, because we want to use that title for something. So stay tuned for that. You'll get an email from GetUp, and I'll make sure that I send it out as well. It should be really super interesting. Warwick's a really excellent speaker. And then our next Zoom talk, I haven't chosen a date yet, but I'm hoping that we will, well, we've definitely got Noah Schutz-Bayard from the Australia Institute, kind of like Get Up. It's a one-woman show here. Noah is a one-man show for the Australia Institute in South Australia. And we'll be talking to him about politics and what the Australia Institute is up to. And he's a fascinating guy, and he's like really clever with looking at the electoral landscape and the issues that might come into play and who's doing what. So yeah, that should be a really good talk as well. I'm not sure when, but probably in about a month's time we'll have that. So that's it from me. Thank you for bearing with me through the ads, the ads at the end of the show. And I will stop the recording, and we'll just say another big thank you to Mark for joining us tonight. Woo!
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.